Imagine a world where you cannot have any lights on at night because lights will cause your house and possibly in your whole neighborhood to be bombed and blown up. Imagine being able to use a jar of jam to get into the movie theater, or for you guys being forced to serve 2 years in the military after you're done with school. All of these things were normal in the life of my interviewee, Joe Forrest, who grew up during the 40s, 50s, and 60s in Yorkshire, England, which is right here. He was actually from West Yorkshire. I'll start off about his life as a young kid in England. English children face many of the same problems as today's children, but they dealt with them in a little different ways. First off was school, where Joe grew up. Families were Catholic, and the church and school were one and the same. There were 3 levels, what we would call grades. There was infant, junior, and senior. An interesting fact that Joe told me that they had to wear gas masks all day at school because of fear of the Germans attacking. And children entertain themselves in many ways that children might still do today. Vicky Barker, who wrote an article about the 50s in England, said that we played cards and board games and talked to each other, and that was, according to Joe, very accurate. Joe said that where he lived, kids got together and they decided what to do for the afternoon. Sometimes they would go to the Saturday matinee, and sometimes they would go to the moors. This is actually right behind the town where Joe grew up. This rock is called the Calf, and that one is called the Cow. And there used to be one called the Bull behind it, but it was broken up to build a hotel in town. And as far as communication, Joe said they used letters mostly, sometimes telegram, and very rarely they would use a telephone that his grandparents owned. They owned a hauling business, and so they had a telephone. He said a very special treat was to talk to Dad on my grandparents' telephone. His dad was stationed in the British coast of the English Channel, shooting down German planes as they tried to come across the channel. English children may have been faced with many of the same problems as children today, but older children or young adults had some very different issues to deal with. As children got older, they were more focused on their career rather than their education. At the age of 18, boys had to serve 2 years in the military. Unless you were an apprentice, which Joe was, he didn't have to serve till he was 21. He actually apprenticed to be a stonemason, which he is still today at 76. And other professions, his dad was a carpenter, his uncle was a motor mechanic, and one of the nuns from his school, her family had a painting and decorating business, and those were all things that you could apprentice to be. And an interesting form of entertainment that I learned from Joe and I did a little research on was pirate radio. In the 60s it started. What happened was the BBC, British Broadcasting Company, ruled the airwaves, the radio and television, and they played, according to Todd Leopold, who wrote an article for CNN about it, Great Britain's ever so popular BBC filled its air with news, gardening tips, dramas, plumbing announcements, and maybe the occasional pop record. And so a group of young kids got together and they put a radio transmitter on a fishing ship, and they sat in international water outside of Britain's jurisdiction, and they played pop records of the day. And the first song was the Rolling Stones' Not Fade Away. And there were 3 ships, Radio Caroline, Radio Atlanta, and Radio London. And they lasted about 4 years until the British government said that people businesses couldn't advertise on them and they lost funding. Before that, there were actually no such things as commercials in England. They had never heard a commercial like we know it today until pirate radio, because the BBC was government owned and operated, so they had no need for them. All these things may be hard to imagine in today's world, but they were typical for Joe and other English kids growing up in the 50s. From bombings to pirate ships, matinees to Royal Marines, there are many things that made up the lives of not only Joe Forrest, but many English children. While some things may seem the same as America at the time or of children today, there are still many things that we cannot even begin to imagine, such as not knowing whether tonight would be the night our neighborhood would be bombed by the Germans, or not ever hearing a commercial on television or